Hello everybody. Today we're going to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. Completing the square is a multi-step process that involves perfect square trinomials as well as solving solving quadratics by square roots, I should say. So you need to understand how to make a trinomial a perfect square trinomial, which we talked about in a previous class. And you also need to make sure you understand how to solve quadratics by square roots. So if you can't do those two things, please go back and rewatch the video lessons on solving by square roots and make sure you understand what a perfect square trinomial is. What's great about solving by completing the square, even though it's a multi-step process, is it could be used to solve any quadratic equation. Solving by square roots has some stipulations, and solving by factoring you could only use for a quadratic equation that can be factored. So solving by square roots is solving by completing the square, is fantastic because we can use it to solve any quadratic equation. Now let's talk about the steps to solving by completing the square. Your first step is to get your variable terms on one side of the equation. Okay? So that would be like your x squared and your linear term. Your next step is to divide every term by your a value. So you want a equal to 1, or you don't want a visible number in front of x squared. Your third step, and actually, by the way, steps 1 and 2, those are interchangeable. It doesn't matter what order you do those in. I think it's easier to do it in the way I have it up there, but they are interchangeable. Now, step 3 is not. Make your variable expression a perfect square trinomial by taking your b value, dividing it by 2, and squaring it. Then you're going to add that answer to both sides. Step 4 is you're going to factor your perfect square trinomial into a quantity squared. 5, you're going to solve your problem by square roots. And again, what's nice about solving by completing the square is it can be used to solve any quadratic equation. So hopefully these steps will make a little more sense now that we're doing a problem. So I definitely would highly recommend copying those steps down and kind of check them off as we do this problem. So our first step is to get our variable terms on one side. So what we're going to do is add 3 to both sides. I'm not going to write that step out because we know if we add 3 to both sides on the left-hand side, it's going to cancel. On the right-hand side, we're going to have positive 3. Your next step is to make your a value equal to 1. Well, if we look at the number in front of x squared, it is 1 already. So we don't have to do step 2. If this was a 2, let's say, or something like that, we would divide everything by 2, including the 3. So we would divide every term on both sides of the equation by 2. That would be the only way to keep it balanced. But again, since a is equal to 1, we don't have to do that second step. So now we're going to make this left-hand side a perfect square trinomial. So we're going to take the b value, which is 6, divide it by 2, and then square that answer, which would be positive 9. That's the value we're going to add to both sides of the equation. Okay. And then step 4 is to factor the left-hand side into a quantity squared. Well, x squared plus 6x plus 9, that is a perfect square trinomial now. That's what this b value divided by 2 squared does. When we add it to both sides, it makes that left-hand side a perfect square trinomial. So it factors into x plus 3 squared. That's a pretty easy one to know, but for the more complicated ones, the trick is the b value divided by 2 is the number that goes right there, including sign. On the other side, 3 plus 9 is 12. Now we're going to solve the problem by square roots. Okay, so this is where, at this step, even though it is solving by completing the square, really at this point, this is solving by square roots. So if we continue on, I will recopy the problem, what we had. We will take the square root of both sides. So now on the left-hand side, we have x plus 3. That's going to equal plus or minus. If we simplify that root there, the 4 is the biggest perfect square that goes into both of those. So the answer would be plus or minus 2 root 3. So now because that's an irrational number on the right-hand side of the equal sign, to finish this, we would just subtract 3 from both sides. And now we can't combine those because they're not like terms. So our final answers would be negative 3 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3. So that again gives us 2 answers. Negative 3 plus 2 root 3, and then negative 3 minus 2 root 3. So there's the process of completing the square. It's a multi-step process, but it's nothing out of anybody's realm. You just have to get used to the process and follow it. It's a very, very important process. Actually, some of the other methods that we'll learn about the quadratic formula next actually is derived from this method. So completing a square has a lot of other application in mathematics as well. So here's another example problem. Excuse my writing there. Try to write as neatly as possible. Let's say we have 2x squared minus x plus 3 equals x plus 9, and we're solving this by completing the square. We got to get our variable terms on one side and our number on the other side. So the first thing we're going to do is subtract x from both sides. So when we're doing that, we have 2x squared minus 2x. And then we'll also subtract 3 from both sides right now currently, and we get equals 6. Okay? So kind of did two steps at once there. We subtracted x to both sides and got the variable terms on the left-hand side. And then I also subtracted 3 and got the constant on the right-hand side. Okay? So now our a value is 2. We got to divide every term by 2. Every term. So we have x squared minus x equals 3. Okay? So now if we continue on the next, now we have to make the left-hand side a perfect square trinomial. Well, our b value is negative 1. So we're going to take that negative 1, divide it by 2, and square it. And since we can't divide negative 1 by 2, we just leave it as negative 1/2. And then when we square it, we get positive 1/4. So that's actually the value we're going to add to both sides. This is a nice problem because it has some fractions in it. And now we made this left-hand side a perfect square trinomial. Now this one's a more complicated one to factor, but the trick is it's always your b value divided by 2 that goes into quantity squared. So it's actually going to be x minus 1/2 squared. So that's a little trick, is just take your b value divided by 2 before you square it. That's the value that goes in the quantity, if it's difficult to factor, for the quantity squared when you make it a perfect square trinomial. Now, 3 over 1, I'll make that. When we add 3 over 1 plus 1/4, I have to make this common denominators of 4, so that would actually be 12 over 4. So that would be 13 over 4 when we add these two together. That's why it's very helpful to know your skills with fractions. So again, 3 over 1 becomes 12 over 4. Now we take the square root of both sides. So we have x minus 1/2. That equals the square root of 13 over 2. And what we did there is, I can't take the square root of 13, so I leave it as root 13. And then the square root of 4 is 2. So we actually try to take the square root of both the numerator and denominator, but we can't. And it's, of course, that's plus or minus because we took the square root of something squared. And now to finish this problem, we'll add 1/2 to both sides. Running out of a little space here. And because of the root there, we're actually going to put that 1/2 in front of the root, and I'll continue this on the next. So when we added 1/2, we had plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2, and then we added 1/2 to both sides. So what we do now, because they have the same denominator, we could add the numerator. So the final answer would be 1 plus or minus root 13 over 2 as our answers for x. So thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully you found this video lesson helpful. Even though I made it look really easy, it is easy, but it's a multi-step process that takes some practice. So make sure you do your homework effectively, follow the steps. It combines perfect square trinomials and solving by square roots. So you need to have those two skills mastered before you do this, but you guys can all do this. And by the way, one more thing here just to add to it. If I could take the square root of 13 and let's say it was a regular integer like 8, and obviously it's not, but then you'd write out two different answers. You'd have 1 plus 8 divided by 2, which would be 9 over 2, and you'd have 1 minus 8 divided by 2, which would be negative 7 over 2. So just to give you a quick example, sometimes you can take these problems further. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a fantastic day.